This is the Capitalism and Freedom in the 21st Century podcast, an official podcast of the Hoover Institution Economic Policy Working Group, where we talk about economics, markets, and public policy. I'm Jon Hartley, your host. Today, my guest is Robert Barro, who is an economics professor at Harvard University. He's widely regarded as one of the founders of new classical macroeconomics, having done incredible path-breaking work in the Empirics of economic growth, Ricardian equivalence, and many, many other areas. Welcome, Robert.
Hello, great to be here.
Robert, I want to first get into your early life. You were born in New York City, and you were a physics undergrad at Caltech and were a Richard Feynman student in the 1960s. And then you transitioned to economics into doing a PhD in economics at Harvard, graduating in 1970. What was it that first got you interested in economics?
Well, I didn't know anything about economics when I started as an undergraduate, and Caltech didn't offer any economics to speak of. They only had a couple of courses. My brother was an economist, and he gave me some influence. And I finally took a course in my junior year, and surprisingly enough, it was on Keynesian economics. It was straight out of the general theory. But I loved the class when I saw it. And I particularly appreciated the combination of technical material, which I was doing a lot of when I was in physics, with applications and particularly uses in a policy context. So the combination of those two things, I think, is what especially attracted me.
Well, I know your PhD advisor was Zvi Grilicus at Harvard, and you returned to Harvard in its economics department in the 1980s, where you've been since. I mean, how has the department changed since you were there as a graduate student? I mean, obviously, there were a lot of changes, I guess. There was perhaps at that time a lot of, when you were a graduate student, a lot of sort of old Keynesian economists. Harvard and MIT have sort of historically been, I think, well known for having folks like Alvin Hansen, who kind of brought a lot of Keynes's ideas to the United States, and obviously University of Chicago, Minnesota, other so-called freshwater places being having a bit of a different perspective, being more so the home of sort of new classical economics, the Chicago School, and so forth. I mean, how exactly did you end up there? Both as when you were a graduate student, what brought you back as a professor? Given that I think it's fair to say that a lot of your work and ideas are somewhat in contrary to that sort of Keynesian tradition at Harvard.
I think it's fair to say that when I was a graduate student at Harvard, it was a low point for the faculty in terms of the economics department. It just was not a very good department, and it had been sort of going downhill for some time. And that was more dominant than the question about whether it was Keynesian or not Keynesian. It really wasn't imparting a good instruction. And it was particularly weak in macroeconomics. And I was working on hyperinflation and macroeconomics more broadly. And I had a very tough time finding a thesis advisor. So it ended up being the case that I was in my third year and I'd gotten a lot of work done in terms of particularly the German hyperinflation. And I had some papers ready. But I decided I should try to get a job, even though I didn't have a thesis advisor or a thesis. And somehow I managed to get a job at Brown University as an assistant professor without having a doctorate or even a thesis advisor. But that actually was a sensible thing to do. It actually worked out. But at some point, I decided I'd better finish up and I needed to get an advisor. And meanwhile, Harvard had hired some really great professors all at once. Ken Arrow, Dale Jorgensen, Marty Feldstein, and Zvi Grilicus. They were all hired just about the same time toward the end of my graduate education. So I decided I should get one of these new people to be my advisor, even though they might not fit exactly by fields. And at some point, I had an appointment with Zvi Grilicus, and I talked to him for half an hour about the work I was doing. And some of it was in econometric applications, which fit with his expertise. So even though he wasn't a macroeconomist, it actually worked out for him to be my advisor, and he was great. And he told me at some point that his whole career, he'd really only had two um, PhD students in macroeconomics, and the other one was Bob Lucas. So I thought that was pretty good. So I was very happy with Svi as my advisor, and I ended up finishing up there.
Well, that's terrific. And I'm curious, like where were you when the rational expectations revolution was happening? Obviously, like when I think about sort of the history of uh, macroeconomic thought and how it kind of evolved in the late 20th century, you had this thing, which was the rational expectations revolution, micro foundations, and so forth that came out of largely the Midwest, University of Chicago, Minnesota, and elsewhere, in this really starting in the 70s. And then over time, it wasn't really till that caught on, and I think pretty successful in terms of changing, at least influencing research, um, in the sort of the subsequent couple of decades, and in part that was a response to, I guess Keynesian models being unable to explain rising inflation and output falling during that period of time in the 70s and 80s. But later on, Harvard sort of caught up, or the new Keynesian sort of a tradition kind of emerged where they took all the rational expectations, micro foundations, theory that had been developed by Lucas, Sargent, Prescott, and others, and then inserted frictions, nominal rigidities, and so forth. So folks like Greg Mankiw, Rich Clarida, Jordi Gali, Mike Woodford, and so forth, and many others. I mean, where were you during that period of time in the rational expectations revolution?
So in the mid 1970s, I left Brown University. I took a position in Chicago. Milton Friedman was still there, and I particularly interacted with him and with Gary Becker and George Stigler. So I worked in that period, particularly on Ricardian equivalence, which has some relation to rational expectations, of course. And I worked a lot on empirical things related to some of Bob Lucas's work. But Lucas actually went back to Chicago a little bit later. And the second time I was in Chicago was when I particularly interacted with him. Uh, so it was in that period from the mid 70s through the mid 1980s, where part of the time I was in Chicago and part of the time I was interacting with Lucas. So that's some of that period.
So I guess diving into some of your research here and talking about Ricardian equivalence, it's this idea that temporary tax cuts shouldn't affect consumption, that debt and taxes are interchangeable, and that you wrote this very famous paper in the I think the 1970s, and this titled are government bonds net wealth, and I think your answer to that is no. And the idea is that government bonds are substitutable with taxes, and it's largely the path of spending that matters, and that agents and consumers will smooth. They'll just save more in response to something like the government issuing more debt or running a deficit. And so I think it has a lot of implications for deficit spending. Governments trying to use deficit spending to juice aggregate demand, which is still a very popular policy approach by governments. Curious, what gave you this idea to study Ricardian equivalence? I mean, it was something that David Ricardo, it wasn't really something that first David Ricardo had championed, but it's something that I think had grown dormant for quite some time. I mean, what led you to studying that, as well as other forms of, I guess, equivalence? You've written papers about government debt management. I think arguing that government debt maturity choice doesn't really matter for non-contingent debt. What led you to this sort of a line of thinking? What was it? Those interactions with Lucas, or was it something else?
No, not something with Lucas, which would have been later. But Ricardian equivalence is important as kind of a baseline idea that under certain circumstances, you get this fairly set of extreme results. And then it forces you to think in a disciplined way about why should you have departures from that and in what direction are the departures going to be. And certainly Ricardian equivalence doesn't always hold, but that doesn't mean the kind of standard analyses of fiscal deficits are valid. And things can go even in the opposite direction. And I had a second paper in end of the 1970s about tax rate smoothing, which was about the function of public debt as a device for financing basically temporary government expenditure. And from a public finance viewpoint, it was important that that method of finance was available. And in that sense, the debt is not irrelevant. And it probably underlies why Britain did so well in financing wars over a couple of centuries, because it provided a very convenient method of financing. So certainly you don't have Ricardian equivalence there, but it becomes kind of a part of public finance in terms of what's the optimal structure of taxation over time. And the public debt management is part of that problem. I gave a seminar on my Ricardian equivalence paper only once, and Friedman, Becker, and Stigler were there at the same time, which is the only time I've seen the three of them together at a seminar, actually.
Wow.
And that was very exciting, and I got some important feedback there. And then from Gene Fama when I gave the paper in the business school in Chicago, and those are the only two times I gave a seminar on that paper, which has proved very influential. So I didn't know when I wrote the paper that it had something to do with David Ricardo, and I didn't call it Ricardian equivalence. That came from Jim Buchanan, who wrote a comment on my paper, and he said, "Well, this is Ricardian equivalence." And then I decided, well, it must be that there was an earlier statement of this before David Ricardo, that you can always go back and find stuff. And then I looked into that. And in fact, I couldn't find any sensible thing before Ricardo that had this viewpoint. So then I decided Ricardian equivalence was a really good name and we should adopt that, which subsequently became the case.
Well, I'm curious, like, how do you feel about, I guess criticism from empirical economists who kind of say, well, Ricardian equivalence, oh, it's wrong. They point to maybe some data about, some micro data maybe that shows that consumers aren't fully smoothing. I think if you look at the macro data, like the 2008 tax rebates in the US or the 2020, 2021 stimulus checks in the US, it's pretty clear that they're largely being saved. So I think at the macro level, there's a lot of smoothing that's going on. But I'm curious, like, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily, it's certainly not full smoothing and perfect smoothing either. I mean, I'm curious, what um, do you just in your mind, is it really just the being an important baseline that's important, or do you think that a lot of empirical economists out there, particularly on the maybe applied micro side of things, that they're using microdata to estimate MPCs or to look at consumer spending responses to fiscal policies? Do you think that they're missing something?
Well, I think it's certainly fair that there can be departures from complete smoothing, and there are good reasons to have certain kind of frictions and informational issues that can produce those kinds of effects. It's certainly not systematically the case that fiscal deficits produce the kinds of Keynesian responses that are often predicted. And some of the departures from Ricardian equivalence can go in the direction opposite to the one that you would normally expect to find. Again, in terms of the tax smoothing, I found it more productive to think about that as a positive theory about how the government is managing the debt. And in that context, it certainly matters. And there's a lot of literature along those lines in terms of the public debt as a kind of part of optimal tax problems, which I think is a good way to look at it.
So I guess I want to talk just a little bit about government spending multipliers because it's a related issue. In 2011, you got into this literature. You published this early Journal of Economics paper with Charles Redlich. It's since become, I think, a very famous paper, titled, Macroeconomic Effects of Government Purchases and Taxes. And you find that, government spending multipliers are low and below one, and that's consistent with other work that's done by Hoover's very own Valerie Ramey. And you found that tax multipliers are a bit higher, and you're largely using uh, government military purchases, military spending for exogenous identification. I'm curious, like, what's your intuition for why this is the case that government spending multipliers are so low in the macro data, and that the tax multipliers are actually somewhat higher? I know Alberto Alsina found a similar thing looking at fiscal consolidations with his co-authors. But I guess I'm curious because I feel like this is definitely one of the most hotly debated topics in macroeconomics, where it feels like, there is progress being made, but it's still a hugely contentious debate where often I think that empirical macro people tend to say one thing, whereas the applied micro people, which might look at, say tax lotteries or something of that nature, using more micro level data, find that MPCs are very high and that government spending multipliers are much higher than one. I'm curious what you think about that tension and where you think that the truth is in all this.
Looking at the variations in military spending in the US context over a fairly long time period is a very good setting for trying to isolate spending multipliers associated with basically exogenous movements in the amount of government expenditure. You wouldn't do this for many countries during wartime because the direct destructive effects of wartime tend to be dominant. And typically in wartime, you would estimate negative spending multipliers associated with military outlays. But the US is different in that respect. It doesn't have that kind of massive destruction associated particularly with World War II. So it was a very good setting, I think, for looking to isolate the effect of these exogenous and large spending changes. So the multipliers were positive. I mean, the right baseline is 0 or not 1. If the multiplier is 1, it means you're basically getting as much output as you're using up, which makes it sound like it's a free thing. So
I guess if
zero,
G is included in GDP, right, you should, some would argue that I guess there's been this big debate recently about whether G should be included in GDP or not. Yeah, Howard Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce, has highlighted this among others. But I guess Simon Kuznets famously said that G should be removed from GDP. So these people aren't exactly alone. But I guess there's this question, which is, even if there weren't offsetting effects that would make the multiplier less than 1 when you're including G in GDP, there's a question of,
but it's not just about terminology. If the multiplier including G is 1, it means that you can get the G for free. It means that your output goes up enough to pay for it. And then if you're saying the stuff is worthless, okay, well, you still didn't have to pay for it, so it's not completely terrible. But the right benchmark is a multiplier of 0, because that means that in order to get the extra spending, let's say for military, you have to cut back on other spending 1 for 1. So I would have looked at that as the benchmark. So we found multipliers that were more like a half or something, which means that you have to pay for 50% of the extra. So it's a multiplier of 1 and above is kind of completely ridiculous. I mean, a multiplier above 1 means you're not only getting the military spending for free, you're getting something extra for coming from nowhere. It should be a very surprising result to have multipliers that are above 1. And you certainly wouldn't find that in normal times or in some kind of long run setting. I mean, it's not true that countries that have more G have more GDP, which would be even enough more GDP to more than pay for the G, which would be weird. So I think that's just not true. But anyway, I think we isolated some effects. I mean, the tax changes typically have incentive effects that are important. So cutting taxes usually means cutting tax rates and providing more incentive to do things like work more and work harder and invest more. So it's not surprising that you might find more potent effects related to cutting taxes, which typically are not lump sum taxes, but something about distorting taxes being reduced.
And I guess any thoughts on, I guess, this idea of crowding out, and that if you get more government spending, more control, I guess it crowds out competition from the private sector in these areas, I guess, is maybe one. It's often one of the most cited, I think, reasons for why government spending multipliers, might be, fairly low. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that kind of crowding out argument.
Yeah, so to have any kind of macro crowding out, you need the multipliers to be less than one. Uh, if they were negative, that would be even more extreme. You'd really have to raise a lot of extra stuff to pay for the spending. Yeah, I think it's a reasonable first line approximation that you have substantial crowding out of private activity when you have more government activity. So some of that is just directly on the expenditure macro side, and some is more along the lines of what you were indicating in terms of crowding out based on the government effectively monopolizing the market or regulating things, and that's going to depress private activity. So yeah, I think crowding out in both of those senses is important.
Hmm. Well, I want to just talk a little bit about fiscal theory of the price level here, because it's also somewhat related to Ricardian equivalence. And it's one of these, I think, similar benchmark kind of results from a pretty simple model. Something you've done some work on lately with Francesco Bianchi. A terrific monograph has been written recently by Hoover's very own John Cochran, titled "Fiscal Theory of the Price Level" on this very topic. I mean, I'm curious, what led you to recently start studying fiscal theory?
For me, I was driven at the empirical level, trying to understand the surge in inflation associated with the COVID crisis, and noting that this was a global phenomenon and wasn't particular to the United States. And then I was trying to think about what kind of macro monetary analysis would lead you to the result that this kind of expansion, which involved a lot of fiscal deficits, a lot of transfer payments, why might that be inflationary? How would you think about that kind of linkage? I think the closer thing to what we ended up doing was the idea of fiscal dominance and the kind of analysis that Lucas and Stokey had in the 1980s in thinking about wartime finance and why it was often accompanied by inflation. So I think that was probably a more important element rather than the fiscal theory of the price level per se, which often involves issues that didn't really have anything to do with what Bianchi and I were doing. Now, certainly there's a government budget constraint that's central to this analysis, and it has to be viewed in an intertemporal sense, so that if you have more spending, you have to pay for it somehow and somewhere. But then it also leads you to the idea that it's possible to pay for it through the kind of contingent fiscal deficits that Lucas and Stokey highlighted. So if you have a massive increase, such as the transfer payments, even more under Biden than under the first Trump administration, a way to avoid paying for that by cutting other spending or by raising taxes is by having a inflation that's surprising from a perspective of a pre-crisis period. And that basically wipes out a lot of real value of the government bonds that are outstanding. And it amounts to a very large temporary source of revenue, which can be something like 10, 15% of the GDP. So it's not a minor deal. And that's empirically about what happened in the US and also in other places. And then people don't like the idea that it might not have been completely crazy to pay for the expenditure in substantial part through this surprise inflation. I get a lot of grief on that point from people who normally are on my side about things, because they just want to think of the inflation as being stupid and being dramatically harmful. So I think what was harmful is the excessive fiscal expansion, particularly under Biden. It was unnecessary to have that vast increase in transfer payments. But given that you had it, we effectively paid for most of it through the surprise inflation. And maybe that part was not so crazy because the alternatives would have been also very costly.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. I think maybe some of that consternation comes from, I guess, people that are wedded to older models, and I guess fiscal theory is something that sort of, I guess, regained interest in part due to Jon's monograph. And yeah, I think it's interesting because I think there's a lot of people at some level, the results of fiscal theory are at some level observationally equivalent with other, you know, say, New Keynesian DSG models, and a lot of their, kind of key results. I mean, you could also find that, deficit spending causes inflation in, old Keynesian, ISLM type, frameworks as well. So I guess, I mean, as far as I see it, I mean, the tension kind of arises from that observational equivalence. I mean, fiscal theory of the price level also puts a big emphasis on expectation, fiscal expectations and how those are shifting. It's very difficult to measure fiscal expectations, and we don't really have, in my mind, really any good measures of it. We do have CBO forecasts, but those are, under current law and policy, and in some level, those don't necessarily, reflect the fact that, markets may believe that, and people may believe that government spending patterns will actually have to change at some point, and that as crazy as these CBO forecasts are, that at some level that the true expectation is something different. But I'm curious. I mean, you
Well,
spent a
let
lot
me
of time.
react to part of that.
You spent a lot of time in
In our, in
DSG,
our
and I'm
in our
curious.
framework, the reason the fiscal expansion leads to inflation works through the budget constraint, which is intertemporal. So somehow you're effectively getting this revenue by reducing the real public debt. And the amount by which you have to reduce the debt is related to how much revenue you need, which is partly related to the fiscal outlay. And as you say, there are other models that might connect fiscal outlay to inflation. But we get other implications of this approach that works through the budget constraint, which ties in with the fiscal theory of the price level. So ask yourself, how much inflation do you need to get a given amount of revenue? How does it relate to how much public debt is outstanding to begin with? So if you don't have any public debt outstanding, you really can't get revenue by reducing the real value of the debt. It doesn't work. And if you have a tremendous amount of public debt outstanding, denominated in nominal terms, then it's relatively easy to get a lot of revenue by wiping out the real value of that debt. So through that channel, we get the prediction that countries that started with more debt relative to GDP, let's say in 2019, before the COVID crisis, they should have less inflation. And countries that started out with little debt should have more inflation, which is sort of counterintuitive, right? You might have thought it would go the other way. But we argue empirically that it works very persuasively, that we do get that result in the data when we look across all the OECD countries. So we're looking at 37 countries here, not just the US. So that's an implication that came specifically from this fiscal theory of the price level approach connected with fiscal dominance. And another implication of that is about the duration of the debt. If the duration of the debt is longer, lower inflation per year will work. Whereas if the duration is very short, you have to have a lot of inflation in this framework. So that's another empirical thing we look at, which works. So the things you argued that are common to the fiscal theory of the price level approach and some other new Keynesian approaches, that's to one side. But then there are these other implications that came more specifically from the framework that we adopted, which turned out to work very well. So I think that's an important positive check mark on our side.
Fascinating. I guess so I'm just curious what your thinking is in terms of just progress in, we're talking about sort of business cycles, government responses, and so forth, and sort of these different macro frameworks to think about these things. I'm curious, what do you think about sort of the progress that New Keynesian DSG models have made, if any? And I'm curious, what do you think the future of business cycle research, macro research should be? I mean, do you think that we need to sort of deconstruct the three equation, New Keynesian DSG model, which has an IS curve, Phillips curve. It has Taylor rule. Taylor rules work pretty well empirically, but we know the Phillips curve is, there's massive debates about all the inflation versus unemployment empirical trade-offs, which don't seem to have a very clear pattern. Some people argue it's now nonlinear. Some people say it's flat, but it used to be steep. And so there's a massive debate over the Phillips curve. I mean, there's some people now that are trying to look at beverage curves, beverage curves which hold up pretty well, and some people trying to build some concepts of say full employment around vacancies. But I think even that is it's pretty limited progress. I'm curious, like in your mind, do we need to go back further and sort of build from scratch the business cycle models of the future? I'm curious what you think the sort of future path of a business cycle macro is.
I think the foundations of new Keynesian macro models are deeply flawed. I think that framework represented a major step backwards from the disequilibrium macro models that were in play earlier in the 1970s. One fundamental problem with the new Keynesian model is it assumes that output is always demand determined, which only makes sense if there's tremendous excess supply of goods all the time. If there's excess supply of goods, excess supply of labor, then that can make sense. But that's not always the case, of course. And sometimes there are important supply constraints. But people who use the new Keynesian macro model use the basic demand determination of output all the time. And it doesn't make sense much of the time. So that's one component of that model that's deeply flawed. The Phillips curve part of it is also very problematic. It tends to predict this very strong correlation between what's going on with GDP and what's going on with inflation. And that's not in the data. So I think a major reconsidering of the new Keynesian macro model, even sticking with a disequilibrium framework with sticky prices, even sticking with that, I think a redoing of the basic model is really called for. And I know some people are working on that currently. Maybe there'll be some success in that finally, which is long overdue because despite all its flaws, the new Keynesian macro model has become almost a monopoly provider in this industry, and it's really quite ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting just to think about all the central bank researchers, I'm sure would be very upset to hear this discussion. But
Well, employment's been cut back a lot at the Federal Reserve
yeah,
banks anyway, I guess. So maybe it goes along with that.
yeah, so exactly. I mean, well, there's been a massive subsidy toward DSG modeling in central banks, and I think that's where certainly a lot of citations come from today. I mean, it's interesting. If you go to most, I think, macro if you talk to or just look at the research that's being done by macroeconomists in a lot of econ departments, there's relatively few that are working on the n+1 iteration of a DSG model. There's many, some that are, and some are using DSG models in other frameworks and so forth. But it's interesting that that it's come this far. But I really don't think, in all the central bankers that have come across, I don't really think that central bankers necessarily make a monetary policy decision or move their dot or move their thinking around monetary policy just because of some new Keynesian output or model output. Most central banks are using VARs for forecasting instead. But it's an interesting question. What sort of framework they should have, and maybe it's maybe it's more just simple thinking around direction. Like sure, maybe the Phillips curve trade-off isn't a very clear one empirically, but raising raising interest rates presumably cools demand, and that's that's good enough for them. So they'll sort of move in that direction until something breaks perhaps. But I guess I'm
Yeah, I
curious.
think the model needs some basic changes and even sticking within the context of simple models. Whereas in fact, the way the research is going is it's just making the new Keynesian models more and more complicated, more and more elements of heterogeneity, more and more detail in terms of enlarging the model. I don't think that's the right channel to be following.
Mhm. Well, I guess I'm curious on more the sticky wages and sticky prices side of things and nominal rigidities. I mean, there's this a famous paper, set of papers from Greg Mankiw and Ricardo Rice on sticky information, which is something that's hard to measure. I mean, in your mind, do you think that sticky wages and sticky prices really matter for in the sense that that they can explain all uh, they are the main contributor to sources of economic fluctuations going back, over the centuries. Is that I mean now I mean prices are becoming I think less sticky at some level. We have the more we use Amazon, those prices are changing. Digital prices are often changing all the time. We think about Uber. Uber prices are dynamic. They're shifting around a lot. I mean, there's been some people who have said, we should really shift toward models with sticky wages instead. Those sorts of contracts are certainly things that are still very sticky. But I guess are you convinced that that nominal rigidities like sticky wages or sticky prices are really that important for determining economic fluctuations?
Well, my view in the 1970s into the 1980s was that sticky prices and wages in nominal terms was not that important in terms of thinking about macroeconomic fluctuations, and that it was hard to see how it could be such a significant element. And that was what led me to stop working in that field around 1980 or thereabouts, quite a ways back. It also made me much more sympathetic to the Lucas type of approach, which had to do with some kind of informational issues. But that approach had a similar kind of a problem. I mean, in that approach, it relied on the fact that people knew about the local prices that they saw and were familiar with, and they were less familiar with the general macro situation, including the general price level. But then it wasn't so convincing that the information involved in not knowing what the price level was could be very important either. So a similar kind of criticism, I think, led me and other people to think that that couldn't be a critical element in business fluctuations. Similar to what you had just said about sticky wages and prices, the sort of incomplete information about the general macro situation, it's hard to see how that could be so important. But then for me, that left me with a void because then I'd eliminated the two main models that were in play. And then once the Lucas style model became less convincing to many people, they returned to, in some sense, the Keynesian model, which led to the new Keynesian model becoming so important. And that relying on particularly sticky prices and then more recently also sticky nominal wages. So it's a strange kind of cycle in terms of how the fields and their influences have evolved going back to the 1970s.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I know macro gets a lot of criticism from applied micro people and saying that it's not making real progress and but it's interesting because these are all I think that these are the biggest questions and I think deserve some serious thinking and serious research on.
Well,
Um,
that's why economic growth became so prominent in the period in the 1990s and into the 2000s. And my own work was primarily on economic growth in terms of theory and empirical work. Um,
Well, I want to get into some of that growth research. So, as you mentioned, some of your most cited work is in the empirics of economic growth, and many of your papers, I think, put together really interesting, I think, new data sets, like your data on consumption disasters, or like really deep recessions or depressions across countries. You've got another sort of data set on educational attainment across countries. I mean, what led you to study the empirics of economic growth? I mean, did that for you, was that sort of a moment that I guess we were just talking about being fed up with kind of the other business cycle macro models, but you know I think Robert Lucas, he had his own sort of, I guess, transformation in thinking. He had this famous phrase saying, once you stop thinking about growth, you can't think about anything else. And we could talk about these recessions, like the Great Recession, which was a 5% divot in the GDP growth trend of the U.S. Or maybe some of your consumption disasters, which are generally, I think, bigger across countries. But at some level, if you look at just the simple difference in GDP per capita levels between, say, the U.S., maybe it's a GDP per capita of around 80,000 versus very poor countries that have GDP per capita around say 10,000. I think China is a bit higher than 10,000, but you just think about, or many countries in Latin America, around the world, maybe close to 10,000. That's a difference of a factor of 8x. And so explaining those differences is just, it feels like a much bigger stakes kind of issue. There's also, I think, not exactly a great, I think it's still very much an open question in terms of what causes economic growth, and is perhaps the most important question in economics. Was that kind of the realization that that led you to study economic growth?
So I think Bob has underestimated the cost of business fluctuations, but I think he was right that economic growth is even more important. So I think he was right to think about that topic and to contribute to that literature, and that's certainly what I also did. So part of that was on the theoretical level, and particularly thinking about technological progress, in line with the work by Paul Romer in particular. I've worked a lot on that. But I guess my more sort of distinctive contribution was in terms of empirical analysis, partly of the neoclassical growth model and its implications for convergence across countries, and partly bringing in some elements of the endogenous growth theory, which particularly became prominent in the 1990s. But that work has led to an unfortunate kind of circumstance. I mean, if you want to think about what matters for growth and how it depends on policies and things like property rights and fertility behavior and education and all those, I mean, the natural empirical arena to consider there is the cross-country experiences, where you have a lot of variety in terms of different policies and institutions being put into place. And you have some hope from that of trying to isolate what things matter for long-run economic growth. And that was the work I particularly put my efforts into in the 1990s, going into the 2000s. And for a while, there was a tremendous interest in that work, and it was probably the most cited part of economics overall. But then you had this kind of so-called credibility revolution in econometrics and identification. And it was clear that to be using this cross-country context leads to a lot of issues where you don't get perfect identification. There are some legitimate problems that arise in terms of various things being endogenous and too many things potentially mattering. But then I don't understand how the outcome from that is supposed to be then you ignore the best data that you have that pertain to these questions, which is this cross-country experience. You almost never have experiences in terms of macroeconomics and growth where you have the kinds of exogenous experiments or near experiments that you would want to get clean identification. And then I think it's really unfortunate that what can be gleaned from the data that are available with the possible identification methods and implementations, and then ignoring that, I think, is a great mistake. But that's the situation we're in now. It's basically you just can't do that kind of work now. It's viewed as not legitimate. And I think that that's really wrong and unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, it's a shame that cross country growth regressions have seemingly kind of disappear, or cross country, I think work in general, forget about just growth accounting and things like that, seems to have disappeared a little bit. I guess, yeah, it's an interesting question, in terms of generalizability and there's lots of people who then will say, well, you should look at some very specific natural experiment in a very small corner of the world. But then there's this question of
Doesn't give you the macro kind of variation that you want.
right, exactly. Like it doesn't the narrower you get or the smaller you get, the easier it is for, I guess, uh, these sorts of small micro effects to be swamped by spillover, general equilibrium incentive effects that you get sort of at the bigger macro level. And so it's and then hence things like external validity, violation of SUTVA and these sorts of things become a valid criticism. But yeah, I'm with you on getting back to cross country of regressions. I want to just talk a little bit about some of your big hits on economic growth. For example, you wrote a famous paper in the 1980s on democracy and growth. Finding no relationship between democracy and growth. Some other economists like Jon Hartley have recently won the Nobel Prize. Vehemently argue the opposite. That democracy causes economic growth, and he's using measures like the Freedom House democracy measures. I'm curious, like, where do you stand in this whole debate? Jeffrey Sachs, I think, was a Harvard colleague as well for a while. I mean, where do you stand in the whole institutions versus culture versus say climate, geography, which is I guess more where Jeffrey Sachs and Guns, Germs, and Steel comes in. Institutions being sort of why nations fail. Jon Johnson and others. I'm curious, where do you stand in that sort of debate between those three sort of key explanations? You do a lot of work on religion and economics as well. Obviously, that I'd say would fit into the, I guess, culture bucket if you were to classify it into those three things. But where do you stand in terms of what causes growth?
Well, I think there were some pretty clear, robust findings from the cross-country growth regression literature from work that I did and other people did. This idea of conditional convergence, I think, is quite robust. That's the idea that if you hold a lot of other things constant, that then having a lower starting position predicts higher growth and a catch-up convergence type of effect. But the fact that you have to condition on other things is central to getting that result. There are more issues about what are the other things, but I think some things come out to be fairly clear. I think institutional measures are quite predictive of growth. Things that look like property rights, rule of law have a pretty robust positive connection to economic growth. Things involving fertility and population growth seem to be pretty reliably negative with respect to per capita GDP growth, which is interesting these days when people are worrying a lot about population growth being too low. There's some interesting recent work related to climate and economic growth over the long term, arguing that you have to look at that in a global context, which is basically the world. And that gets you into the realm of looking at this time series on macro variables being basically world GDP. But there's a recent paper which has interesting results suggesting quite large negative effects from temperature rises on global GDP. As you say, some people have looked at religion and economic growth as part of the cultural phenomena. My wife, Rachel McCleary, and I had some interesting findings there. I thought we argued that what mattered in terms of religion was something like believing relative to belonging. So some measures of religious beliefs, but kind of contingent on how much participation, church attendance there was. So we found that stronger beliefs seem to underlie things like Max Weber's work ethic, and thereby promote economic growth. But just going to church more often didn't seem to have that kind of beneficial effect. Anyway, I think there's, if you put it all together, I think there's a lot of interesting work cross-country in terms of determinants of economic growth. And I think it's a field that needs to be reestablished as being legitimate, basically.
Well, I know that you also spent a lot of time in sort of promoting the idea that human capital matters. I think this is maybe a fourth school that I think largely, is a lot of been championed by a lot of people. I'd say, in the Chicago school world, University of Chicago, who've done a lot of work on education. And I guess I'm curious what your thoughts are there. I mean, it's interesting, there's all these debates recently about industrial policy, what other questions around that, and work by Larry Katz here, on training programs, workforce sectoral training programs that seem to, at least in RCTs, seem to to work well compared to other sorts of job training programs, say from the Great Society era, that don't work well. To me, even though these things are being rebranded as things like industrial policy, at some level, if you look at like South Korea, which some people attribute to being an industrial policy success story, it's a place that where its industrial policy was largely human capital related. So at some level, it's a question. Maybe a lot of these things are just human capital rebrandings. But in your mind, is education really central to economic growth?
So
Or
John Wally and I
broadly
I
speaking?
put together this major data set, which people use a lot. So it's just on quantity of schooling. It's about years of school attainment at various levels. And for most countries in the world, going back to the 1950 or so, and you can go back earlier for some set of countries. So that's one of the variables that has a central role in terms of determinants of economic growth. And we also distinguish education by gender as part of that kind of analysis. So the two major data sets I think that I put together until recently were the one with John Wally and the other one with Jose Ursua was data that you mentioned before in terms of the long-term data on macroeconomic disasters. More recently, I'm putting together this data on very long-term attendance at religious services, which I think is another kind of data set, not so much of a macro data set, but I think that's another one that's going to have a lot of use.
Well, it's fascinating and amazing work. And I remember, when you were talking about, I think a couple decades ago, you were interviewed, I think, about Bono at that time in the 2000s was a very vocal advocate of aid, and I remember you're a bit critical of aid, certainly government aid being that useful in terms of spurring economic growth. This was, I think, around the time that U2 was doing its Elevation tour with its, I think, 2000 album, All the Things You Can't Leave Behind, and you said it was a great album. So and I think I agree with you on that. But you've been so influential in so many topics in macro, and you've advised many students who've gone on to have incredible academic careers. Michael Kramer, Emmy Nakamura, George Marios, Angeletos, Xavier Gabay, Xavier Sally Martin, Zvi Herkovitz, many others, and some of them have gone on to win Nobel Prizes. I mean, what in your mind makes good advising for PhD students?
A couple of remarks about Bono. So Jeff Sachs set it up for me to have lunch with him and Bono. So when he invited me, to show you how ignorant I was, I didn't know anything about Bono. So I consulted with my daughter. And I said, I've been invited to have lunch with this guy who's apparently a rock star, and I don't know him. What should I do? And my daughter said, well, of course, you have to go. Absolutely. I was actually very impressed by him. He's extremely intelligent and he's extremely quick on picking things up. Obviously, he doesn't have a background, for example, in economics, but he was seriously interested in getting ideas related to things he was interested in, which is particularly about debt relief and foreign aid at the time. But he didn't want somebody who was going to just echo his visions on those matters. He wanted to get alternative views probably because he wanted to know how to defend against arguments that were against what he really wanted to push. But anyway, it was a very good discussion. So I didn't really agree with his basic positions, and I don't think that forgiving debt is the way to promote economic growth for poor countries. And I don't think foreign aid has been successful at all. And I think if we're cutting back on USAID, as we seem to be doing at the moment, I think that's a great idea. I strongly support that. In terms of my PhD students, yes, I've had some wonderful PhD students over the years. I'm hoping that Emi Nakamura and John Steinson will join us soon at Harvard, since they have offers now to join the faculty of the economics department. And they were particularly great students of mine. Michael Creamer, as you mentioned, was, of course, a wonderful student who had 2 classic articles as part of his PhD thesis. At the time, he was doing mostly macro growth, but he shifted more toward micro type things in terms of developing countries, and in particular, applying experimental designs in those contexts. I think that's really what he got the Nobel Prize for. But he's still interested in the macro type work as well. There's a great variation in terms of how one works with the graduate students. You mentioned Xavier Gabex. Gabex was a complete self-starter and did everything on his own. And then at some point, he basically awarded me a prize by asking me to be his PhD advisor. And I don't think I get much credit for what he has produced, which has been very high quality, but I don't think I had that much influence on it. So that varies a lot across the students. And I don't know how to say what it is that makes one successful in terms of advising great students. To some extent, it's not so different from coming up with ideas from one's own research, but I guess also it does involve some different dimensions.
Well, it's amazing. You advised a tremendous number of students, and I'm sure many of them will listen to this, and I'm sure we'll enjoy this. What's been an amazing conversation. Robert, really want to thank you for coming on. This has been really great. It's been a thrill to have you on and hear your ideas.
Okay, it's been great for me as well.
This is the Capitalism and Freedom, the 21st Century podcast, an official podcast of the Hoover Economic Policy Working Group, where we talk about economics, markets, and public policy. I'm Jon Hartley, your host. Thanks so much for joining us.